This is a story of tragedy, the chronicle of an emancipationist monetary technology subverted to other ends. It is painful to watch since we had the chance to free the world. That chance was missed, likely hijacked and subverted. Bitcoin gained traction from the earliest days and seemed to offer a viable alternative path for the future of money. At long last, after thousands of years of government corruption of money, we finally had a technology that was untouchable, sound, stable, democratic, incorruptible, and a fulfillment of the vision of the great champions of freedom from all history. That was the vision. Alas, it did not happen. The past 13 years of my life have been spent trying to make Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies the money of the future. The technology has the potential to make the world a radically freer and more prosperous place, and it will end up being one of the most important inventions of all time. I have spent more than a decade evangelizing about the benefits of Bitcoin, funded numerous startups within the industry, built my own businesses around it, and have seen the price increase by more than 6,500,000%. Yet this book is not a love story, and I wish it did not have to be written. The project I got involved with in 2011 has been hijacked and changed for the worse. Bitcoin was designed to be digital cash, usable in everyday commerce, with minimal fees and fast transactions, and it worked that way for years. But today, Bitcoin is thought to be digital gold, not meant for everyday commerce, with high fees and slow transactions. A complete reversal of the original design. It's discussed as a store of value, with little care for its utility as a payment system. Some people even claim that Bitcoin cannot work as a payment system because it does not scale. These common ideas are simply untrue. The reason that Bitcoin is no longer used as digital cash has nothing to do with the underlying technology. It's because a group of software developers took over the project, decided to change its design, and intentionally limited its functionality, whether due to incompetence, sabotage, or a mixture of both. The takeover happened from roughly 2014 to 2017, and it ultimately resulted in the network splitting in two and the cryptocurrency industry fracturing into 1,000 pieces. The original design still exists and remains extremely promising, but it no longer trades under the ticker symbol BTC. Rapid price appreciation, followed by a crash of 80% or more, is a regular cycle that has been repeated several times in Bitcoin's short history. The volatility makes for good news headlines, since the general public is almost exclusively focused on price. But for me, Bitcoin has always been more than just a financial investment. It's a magnificent tool for increasing the amount of economic freedom in the world.
I think a lot of people are underestimating the way in which Bitcoin and the blockchain are going to change the power structures in society in general. I grew up in the US, and I see all these people like, yeah, nuke everybody in the Middle East and kill them all. And then they have the former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright on 60 Minutes, one of the most popular news shows in the US. And they asked her, they said, like, there's reports that more than 500,000 Iraqi children have died as a direct result of US sanctions. And she looks back at her with a straight face and she goes, it was a really tough decision, but I think that it was worth it. Worth murdering 500,000 kids because of what the government did? And I apologize for crying, but it just disgusts me from my core when I see government people murdering people around the world. It's not just theoretical. These are real people with real lives. And it's real people, and Bitcoin has the power to undermine everything they're doing to people around the world. And I'm sorry for shouting, but it just disgusts me what these people in government do. And they do it through central banking and through the control of the money supply, and Bitcoin takes that away from them.
The early Bitcoin community was filled with eccentric people and unusual ideas. I greatly value human freedom and believe individuals should have maximum control over their own lives. Bitcoin was naturally appealing to me, as it was designed to operate without a central governing authority. People do not have to ask permission to use it. There's no Bitcoin central bank that controls the supply of coins, and the technology does not recognize international borders. Few things have more potential for increasing global freedom than fast, cheap, permissionless, inflation-proof digital money. In my mind, Bitcoin gets us one step closer to a more technologically sophisticated future in which everybody's life is improved. Armstrong, the co-founder and CEO of Coinbase, captured this sentiment perfectly in an article entitled, "How Digital Currency Will Change the World," by stating, "Digital currency may be the most effective way the world has ever seen to increase economic freedom. If this happens, the implications are profound. It could lift many countries out of poverty, improve the lives of billions of people, and accelerate the pace of innovation in the world, reduce wars, make the poorest 10% better off, overthrow corrupt governments, and raise happiness." My enthusiasm quickly turned into evangelism, and I was nicknamed Bitcoin Jesus for preaching the gospel of Bitcoin to anybody who would listen, and to plenty of people who wouldn't. By 2015, Bitcoin had built up so much momentum that it looked unstoppable. Prominent companies from Microsoft to Expedia were starting to accept it for payment, and the young industry was growing exponentially. The successes started to pile up. Venture capital increased. Media coverage became positive. Bitcoin was on a direct flight to the moon. Fast forward to today. Despite being a household name, Bitcoin has not yet taken over the world. In fact, there's a grim truth beyond the headlines and price charts. The actual usage of Bitcoin has declined since 2018, and many businesses have dropped it entirely as a payment option. In times of network congestion, the average fee can reach more than $50, and transactions can take days or even weeks to process. High fees, unreliable payments, custodial wallets, and less usage in commerce. By other metrics than price, Bitcoin has not landed on the moon. It hasn't even left orbit. On its current course, Bitcoin will not empower the average person. The project has stagnated over the past few years, not because of technological failures, but because of human failures, specifically bad leadership in a flawed governance model. The original scalable design of Bitcoin still exists, but it's not traded on cryptocurrency exchanges under the ticker symbol BTC. It's called Bitcoin Cash and is traded as BCH. For years, the industry was thwarted by the BTC developers until 2017, when a new network was created to preserve the original vision of Bitcoin as digital cash with low fees, fast transactions, and without the need for custodial wallets. The BCH network is far less well-known than BTC, but it has already scaled its throughput capacity to more than 30 times BTC's, with plans to scale exponentially into the future. The word Bitcoin by itself refers to the underlying technology that is used on both networks. Both Bitcoin Core and Bitcoin Cash use Bitcoin technology and share the exact same transaction history until they're split in August 2017. The Bitcoin Core developers decided to pivot from the original design, while the Bitcoin Cash developers have stuck with it. If this technology really is revolutionary, then it threatens the power of existing financial and political establishments. But on the current trajectory, if nothing changes, those institutions will assimilate cryptocurrencies and neutralize them. If Bitcoin is going to make the world a freer place, our window of opportunity is closing. The industry is approaching two failure scenarios. The first would be total capture by existing financial and regulatory systems. Mass adoption of custodial wallets makes this possible, as transactions are easily tracked and controlled, and governments can force companies into compliance without difficulty. The other failure scenario would be people simply giving up and abandoning the vision of inflation-proof digital cash altogether. I have seen many talented minds and competent businessmen prematurely conclude that Bitcoin cannot scale because of Bitcoin Core's failure. This disillusionment can be avoided if people realize that the original Bitcoin technology still exists, works well, and can scale to handle global adoption. Bitcoin Core simply pivoted from this design before losing faith in blockchain technology. Entrepreneurs and developers need to first experience the original version. I am constantly trying out new cryptocurrencies, and Bitcoin Cash still provides me with one of the best user experiences after all these years. To see past the narrative and truly understand the difference between Bitcoin Core and Bitcoin Cash, we must first understand how Bitcoin was originally designed. Satoshi Nakamoto had many public communications about his invention that explain its design. Other great minds and engineers that succeeded him, like Gavin Anderson and Mike Hearn, also explained the core ideas in a clear manner. There's no single agency that processes all the transactions or determines the entries of the ledger. Instead, it's maintained and updated by a decentralized network of computers around the world, giving it no central point of control or failure. Miners update the ledger by bundling transactions together into a block and then adding a special proof. This proof is a solution to a math puzzle, which is so difficult, it takes substantial computer power to figure out. All over the world, there are warehouses filled with specialized machines dedicated to solving these puzzles. Each one of these machines requires electricity, which means it costs money to be a Bitcoin miner. Miners are financially rewarded for their services with two mechanisms: transaction fees and a block reward. The block reward is how new Bitcoins are minted. Every time a miner adds a block to the chain, he's given a small number of new Bitcoins. This reward is cut in half roughly every 4 years. Eventually, the reward will be negligible, which will leave transaction fees as the only source of revenue for miners. Big blockers see miners as performing an essential service in the Bitcoin industry by protecting the network from attacks, maintaining the ledger, and processing all transactions. Miners frequently invest millions or even tens of millions of dollars to upgrade to more powerful equipment. Bitcoin mining has high investment and maintenance costs. Because of this, most big blockers think that miners should have the greatest say in the development of Bitcoin. Blocks themselves are central to understanding the different philosophies in Bitcoin, which can roughly be split into two camps: big blockers and small blockers. The larger the blocks, the larger the transaction throughput of the network, and the more resources it takes to process each block. Small blockers want to keep blocks small enough so that anybody can process them. Small blockers tend to have a more skeptical or even hostile view towards miners. Because miners are the only ones that can add blocks to the network, they have substantial power and could become a systemic threat if mining becomes too centralized. Large mining facilities also introduce a political risk into the system. If governments decide to attack, regulate, or control the biggest miners, they might be able to disrupt or control Bitcoin. Satoshi Nakamoto described a method for simplified payment verification, SPV, that allows users to send, receive, and validate their own transactions with minimal effort. For most of Bitcoin's history, the majority of wallets used either SPV or other similar methods for accessing the blockchain. This trend is reversing in BTC due to the proliferation of custodial wallets, but it remains the norm in BCH. SPV allows you to validate your own transactions, while full nodes allow you to validate all transactions on the blockchain. Arguably, the biggest difference between the big block and small block philosophies is about the role of full nodes. Big blockers think that the vast majority of activity on the network should be between miners and lightweight wallets that use SPV or similar technology. They think full nodes are only useful in special cases where you need to validate many people's transactions in a short period of time. For example, if you're running a cryptocurrency exchange or payment processor. Since the network gives no financial compensation to full node operators, and since most people have no need to validate strangers' transactions, regular users do not have an incentive to run such heavy-duty software. Satoshi was unequivocally a big blocker, and as he put it, the design supports letting users just be users. Small blockers, by contrast, think that full nodes are essential to the network. They think that users should run their own nodes, which is why having small blocks is essential, since the cost of running a node increases with the size of the blocks. In fact, the primary reason that small blockers have claimed Bitcoin cannot scale is because big blocks are more expensive for node operators. Instead of concluding that regular users are not supposed to run full nodes, they concluded that Bitcoin cannot scale. What evidence do we have that Bitcoin was purpose-built to be a payment system? Well, everything that its creator wrote on the subject. In addition to the seminal white paper that introduced Bitcoin to the world, We have hundreds of online forum posts and more than 50 public email correspondences from Satoshi. They paint a clear vision for the technology. Let's start with the white paper, released in 2008. Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Satoshi could have called it an electronic store of value, if that's what he intended, but instead he called it an electronic cash system. Next, the very first sentence of the abstract reads, a purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. Online payments are literally mentioned in the first sentence of the paper, introducing Bitcoin to the world. After the abstract, the introduction begins. Commerce on the internet has come to rely almost exclusively on financial institutions, serving as trusted third parties to process electronic payments. While the system works well enough for most transactions, it still suffers from the inherent weaknesses of the trust-based model. In the first two sentences of the introduction, Satoshi mentions commerce on the internet, electronic payments, and transactions. He continues, completely non-reversible transactions are not really possible since financial institutions cannot avoid mediating disputes. The cost of mediation increases transaction costs, limiting the minimum practical transaction size and cutting off the possibility for small casual transactions, and there is a broader cost in the loss of ability to make non-reversible payments for non-reversible services. With the possibility of reversal, the need for trust spreads. These costs and payment uncertainties can be avoided in person by using physical currency, but no mechanism exists to make payments over a communications channel without a trusted party. In other words, existing online payment methods have high transaction costs due to the inherent trust required in the system. Credit cards, PayPal, and so forth all depend on companies with expensive dispute resolution mechanisms. These costs make small, casual transactions effectively impossible over the internet. By contrast, physical cash payments do not require trust in third parties, but there is no way to use physical cash online. What is needed is an electronic payment system based on cryptographic proof instead of trust, allowing any two willing parties to transact directly with each other without the need for a trusted third party. Transactions that are computationally impractical to reverse would protect sellers from fraud, and routine escrow mechanisms could easily be implemented to protect buyers. In other words, Bitcoin is like cash because the transacting parties can exchange directly with each other without going through a middleman. In the first few paragraphs, the white paper makes it clear that Bitcoin is about commerce, transactions, payments, merchants, buyers, and sellers. There is no mention of a store of value in the entire white paper. Even in Satoshi's emails and forum posts, the concept of Bitcoin as a store of value can only be inferred a handful of times. Sam Patterson, co-founder of the cryptocurrency company OB1, wrote a popular article in which he cataloged every single mention of Bitcoin as a payment system versus a store of value. He concluded, after reviewing all of Satoshi's writings, I can confidently state that Bitcoin was not purpose-built to first be a store of value. It was built for payments. Satoshi mentioned payments more than 4 times more frequently than store of value. This evidence might be sufficient for you to disregard the claim Bitcoin was purpose-built to first be a store of value. It's not just the white paper that makes it clear Bitcoin is about payments. Satoshi was equally clear in the online forums. The forums are filled with similar discussions about using Bitcoin in commerce. Satoshi and others talked about creating interfaces for online merchants, tools for physical merchants, point-of-sale transactions, use cases where the customer is uneasy about using a credit card, keeping small amounts of Bitcoin on mobile devices for incidental expenses, and so on. There is no doubt that Satoshi designed Bitcoin to be used for payments, even those as small as a few cents. In fact, the original version of the software contained unfinished code for a peer-to-peer marketplace and even the basic framework for virtual poker. The broader Bitcoin industry, too, was building on the assumption that Bitcoin was a fast, cheap, reliable payment system for the internet. Successful companies like BitPay, the largest Bitcoin payment processor in the world, had their entire business model challenged by unreasonably high fees. In an interview in 2017, CEO Stephen Pear said, At BitPay, the Bitcoin blockchain has stopped working for us, and we have a couple of options. One is we start using a fork of Bitcoin. The second option is we start using a fork of Bitcoin. And the third option is we start using a fork of Bitcoin. We are really at a point where we have no choice, and that's what we have to do. BitPay was one of the first companies that integrated Bitcoin Cash after the split. Brian Armstrong, the CEO of Coinbase, also shared the same vision for Bitcoin as digital cash for the world. And in a 2017 interview, he explained why BTC's failure to scale broke his heart. The reason why I got really passionate about Bitcoin and digital currency is that I want the world to have an open financial system where all payments are fast, cheap, instant, and global. And Bitcoin ended up not scaling to be that. I believe you could actually operate the Bitcoin network, even at Visa scale, for maybe 2 to 3 orders of magnitude less than Visa is charging today. So it could be something on the order of 1 cent or less to send every payment in the world. But I think other networks like Bitcoin Cash are all working on this. And so that vision is going to be realized. But it was a little frustrating to not see the original Bitcoin get there. Armstrong's opinion was common among early Bitcoin entrepreneurs and early Bitcoiners generally. Calling any existing cryptocurrency a reliable long-term store of value is premature, considering the wild price fluctuations that are a regular occurrence. The fact that BTC has greatly appreciated in price over the past 10 years does not mean it is a store of value. Ingenious has one of the most extreme versions of digital gold maximalism out there. He envisions a future in which regular people don't even touch the blockchain, and on-chain transactions are reserved for high-value transfers only. In the Bitcoin Standard, he writes, Bitcoin can be seen as the new emerging reserve currency for online transactions, where the online equivalent of banks will issue Bitcoin-backed tokens to users while keeping their hoard of Bitcoins in cold storage. And in an online discussion, he writes, Bitcoin on-chain payments aren't for the merchant, they're for central banks. You can have all the world's payment networks built on top of Bitcoin, only settling on-chain. BTC is like central bank gold under a gold standard. This sentiment is echoed by popular Bitcoin commentator Tour de Meester. At full maturity, using the Bitcoin blockchain will be as rare and specialized as chartering an oil tanker. These ideas are now discussed as if they have been the dominant vision since the beginning, but compared to the original design, they are wild and unnecessary. Like so many other public personalities who speak with confidence about Bitcoin, Ingenious and de Meester merely assume that additional layers will solve BTC's usability problems without any issue. Yet when you actually look at second-layer technologies, their viability remains uncertain, especially if the base layer does not scale. These problems are generally not recognized by BTC enthusiasts who instead believe that engineers will fix everything in the future, despite their poor track record so far. Furthermore, a future of Bitcoin-backed tokens is a guarantee that arbitrary inflation will continue plaguing those of us who are not central bankers. History demonstrates that currencies inevitably lose their backing over time, and if people are forced to trade promises of Bitcoin instead of actual Bitcoin, it's only a matter of time before the promises are inflated far beyond the actual supply of Bitcoin. Second layers only make this inflation easier to conduct. Within the Bitcoin community, the narrative started shifting from digital cash to a store of value over a period of several years. With each additional merchant accepting it, Bitcoin gained more credibility and utility. But after the fee spike in late 2017, rather than admit there was a problem, the most influential BTC proponents cleverly started to change the narrative. In recent years, people have even been encouraged not to spend their coins in commerce because BTC is for buying and holding indefinitely. Satoshi understood that the transmissibility of Bitcoin was a central feature that gave it value. Yet that feature was intentionally destroyed by the Bitcoin core developers, giving BTC almost no unique value proposition when compared to other cryptocurrencies. Not only do other coins have lower fees, they also have superior non-monetary functionality. The famous internet entrepreneur Kim.com, founder of Megaupload, expressed similar sentiments in a conversation in January 2020, saying, "In order to be a very successful cryptocurrency, you need to provide fast and cheap transactions. There's no way around that. It's nice to be a store of value, but if you really want to succeed in this game, you need to be electronic cash." Kim also pointed out that the vast majority of people still have no experience using cryptocurrencies, and in order to onboard them, fees need to be low and reliability needs to be high. Most people will go with the currency that gives them the cheapest fees, the fastest transactions, the most reliability, and currently, unfortunately, that is not BTC. By the time Satoshi Nakamoto left Bitcoin, there were many enthusiastic and talented developers working on the project, but two stand out as exceptional: Gavin Andresen and Mike Hearn. When Bitcoin was originally coded, there was no explicit limit on the size of blocks that could be produced. That changed in 2010 when Satoshi added a block size limit to prevent a potential denial of service attack while Bitcoin was young. The initial limit was set to 1 megabyte, allowing for a theoretical limit of 7 transactions per second. The plan was to simply increase the limit or eliminate it entirely. Ray Dillinger, another early Bitcoin pioneer, said the same thing. "I'm the guy who went over the blockchain stuff in Satoshi's first cut of the Bitcoin code." Satoshi didn't have a 1 megabyte limit in it. The limit was originally Hal Finney's idea. Both Satoshi and I objected that it wouldn't scale at 1 megabyte. Hal was concerned about a potential denial of service attack, though. And after discussion, Satoshi agreed. But all three of us agreed that 1 megabyte had to be temporary, because it would never scale. To this day, the Bitcoin core developers have refused to meaningfully increase the block size limit beyond the initial level set in 2010, despite the massive improvements in software, hardware, and networking technology. Instead, they changed the metric of block size into block weight and claim the new limit is 4 megabytes. But this is mostly an accounting trick and does not correspond to a quadrupling of throughput capacity. The simple reason the core developers refused to increase the limit is because they wanted to change Bitcoin's design. The sooner the blocks became full, the sooner the transaction fees would rise, which they viewed as desirable. Jorge Timon, a core developer, stated, "I agree that hitting the limit wouldn't be bad, but actually good for a young and immature market like Bitcoin fees." While Greg Maxwell stated bluntly, "There is nothing wrong with full blocks. Full blocks is the natural state of the system." To appreciate just how radical these ideas are, contrast them with the ideas you would have encountered in the early days of Bitcoin, when the Visa network was often used as a comparison for transaction throughput. All the way back in 2009, Satoshi was asked about Bitcoin's ability to scale and said, "The existing Visa credit card network processes about 15 million internet purchases per day worldwide. Bitcoin can already scale much larger than that, with existing hardware for a fraction of the cost. It never really hits a scale ceiling." This was the common understanding for years. Though today we would call it part of Satoshi's vision, it was nearly everybody's vision back then. Why would the Bitcoin core developers want high fees? To the early Bitcoin enthusiast, or even to the average person, it sounds like an obviously bad idea. Peter Wheeler, another core developer, said, "My personal opinion is that we, as a community, should indeed let a fee market develop, and rather sooner than later." They euphemistically call the backlog of high-fee transactions a fee market, where users outbid each other for the tiny amount of space inside blocks. This bizarre and unnecessary security model is why the core developers celebrate and encourage high fees and a backlog of transactions. Greg Maxwell claimed, "Fee pressure is an intentional part of the system design and to the best of the current understanding essential for the system's long-term survival." So, yes, it's good. And when fees rose to $25 in December 2017, Maxwell infamously responded, "Personally, I'm pulling out the champagne that market behavior is indeed producing activity levels that can pay for security without inflation." and also producing fee-paying backlogs needed to stabilize consensus progress as the subsidy declines. Of course, Satoshi Nakamoto did not design Bitcoin this way. Satoshi was asked about the long-term revenue model for miners. He explained, "In a few decades, when the reward gets too small, the transaction fee will become the main compensation for miners. I'm sure that in 20 years there will either be very large transaction volume or no volume." By artificially limiting the block size, the Bitcoin core developers found a way to completely change the dynamics of the system. Not only did the user experience change from nearly instant and free transactions to expensive and unreliable, the underlying economic model was radically changed as well. BTC is gambling on the idea that future users will be willing to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars per on-chain transaction, despite having superior alternatives. Otherwise, miners will have to shut down most of their equipment because they won't generate a profit. Given this, it's no exaggeration to say that BTC was hijacked, and the original design was replaced with a new speculative one. This is why Vitalik Buterin, the co-founder of Ethereum, publicly said, "I consider BCH a legitimate contender for the Bitcoin name. I consider Bitcoin's failure to raise block sizes to keep fees reasonable to be a large, non-consensual change to the original plan, morally tantamount to a hard fork." Bitcoin Core's failure to increase the block size limit was not merely academic. It had real-world consequences for the businesses building on Bitcoin or merely accepting it for payment. After the 2017 fee spike, the Bitcoin industry experienced anti-adoption for the first time. When the popular gaming platform Steam announced they were no longer accepting Bitcoin, they publicly shared their reasons why. With the transaction fee being so high right now, it is not feasible to refund or ask the customer to transfer the missing balance, which itself runs the risk of underpayment again. At this point, it has become untenable to support Bitcoin as a payment option. We may reevaluate whether Bitcoin makes sense for us and for the Steam community at a later date. The public was told that high fees are perfectly fine, that you aren't supposed to use Bitcoin for everyday purchases, and that blockchains actually can't scale. Bitcoin was designed to scale with larger blocks. So why would anybody think that big blocks are a problem? Core developer Vladimir van der Laan stated in 2015, "I understand the advantages of scaling. I do not doubt a block size increase will work. Although there may be unforeseen issues, I'm confident they'll be resolved. However, it may well make Bitcoin less useful for what sets it apart from other systems in the first place. The possibility for people to run their own bank without special investment in connectivity and computing hardware. There are several problems with this idea. Bitcoin was designed so that regular people don't have to run their own full nodes. A full node downloads a copy of the entire blockchain and validates every single transaction on the network. This is unnecessary for almost everybody. They can use lighter software. Satoshi designed Bitcoin with simplified payment verification, SPV, in mind, which allows users to verify their own transactions with a tiny amount of data. Satoshi was not foolish enough to design a cash system where every user had to download and verify the entire world's transactions. There's no way such a system could scale. The fact that the costs of validation increase with the size of blocks is not a problem. Satoshi could not have been clearer when he wrote, "The current system where every user is a network node is not the intended configuration for large scale. That would be like every Usenet user running their own NTP server. The design supports letting users just be users. The more burden it is to run a node, the fewer nodes there will be. Those few nodes will be big server farms. The rest will be client nodes that only do transactions and don't generate." And also when he stated only people trying to create new coins would need to run network nodes. At first, most users would run network nodes, but as the network grows beyond a certain point, it would be left more and more to specialists with server farms of specialized hardware. Satoshi was so clear about this that it's impossible to misinterpret. It's fine to dislike this idea, but it's how Bitcoin was designed. The other attempt to rescue the small block philosophy involves an appeal to secondary layers, since if most transactions are off-chain, then perhaps the fees can be low on the secondary layers. While it does make sense to build multiple layers in Bitcoin, in order to work correctly, the base layer must be scalable. If the base layer can only process 7 transactions per second, it's not even close to being robust enough to build additional layers on top. Second layers still have to interact with the base layer, so high fees remain a fundamental problem. For example, the Lightning Network still requires occasional on-chain transactions to use, and those fees have to be paid by someone. Right now, many popular wallets are subsidizing these costs for their users, but if $50 plus fees are the norm, that model is simply not sustainable. Elon Musk is one person who seems to understand the value of scaling the base layer for cryptocurrencies. In a Twitter thread about network design, he shared his thoughts as an engineer. BTC and ETH are pursuing a multi-layer transaction system, but base layer transaction rate is slow and transaction cost is high. There is merit to maximizing base layer transaction rate in minimizing transaction cost. Block size and frequency should steadily increase to match broadly available bandwidth. If Musk had been around at the time, he would have agreed with Satoshi, Andreessen, Hearn, and most of the early Bitcoin entrepreneurs. There is just no substitute for cheap on-chain transactions. This is the small block perspective on full nodes. 1. Miners have an incentive to hijack Bitcoin by changing the rules in their favor. For example, increasing the block reward. 2. Miners are prevented from arbitrarily changing the rules because full nodes do not blindly follow the majority mining power. These ideas have become the orthodoxy, and both of these claims are false. At first glance, it might seem like miners could profit from creating new coins out of thin air. However, this overlooks the reason why Bitcoins have value in the first place. Value is not intrinsic. It comes from a complex web of beliefs that people have about the entire Bitcoin network. If the miners decided to produce 1 billion new Bitcoins for themselves, they would destroy the underlying trust in the system, which would destroy the value of each Bitcoin. They might have 1 billion more Bitcoins, but each one would be worthless. Miners are not a threat to the system. If anything, miners are least incentivized to break Bitcoin since their only revenue comes from transaction fees and the block reward, both of which are denominated in Bitcoins that must be sold on the market. The second major claim is that full nodes can somehow prevent the rules of the network from changing. They cannot. Full nodes can only verify whether blocks and transactions are valid. Imagine that a new bug is discovered in the protocol that breaks Bitcoin in an important way, and the software has to be upgraded in a short period of time. The miners will upgrade immediately, since their profits depend on the network running. But what would happen if everyone else running full nodes didn't upgrade? Would the miners be prevented from upgrading altogether? Not at all. Miners would continue on just fine adding blocks to the chain, and the full nodes would simply split themselves off the main network. It doesn't require a large network of full nodes to notify people that the rules have changed. It only requires a single honest miner, or even a single honest node. Anyone can prove to the world that a particular block or transaction is invalid according to the old rules. Even if 100% of the miners were in collusion, a single full node could still demonstrate that the rules changed. Therefore, it's essentially guaranteed that everybody would find out. I want to be able to run a full node from my home computer. Does anybody actually care about that? Satoshi didn't. His vision was home users running SPV nodes and full nodes being hosted in data centers. By the end of 2010, Satoshi decided that he needed somebody else to run the project. So he chose Andreessen, who shared the same vision for Bitcoin. With Satoshi's blessing and with great reluctance, I'm going to start doing more active project management for Bitcoin. In 2014, Andreessen said he was shifting from the day-to-day maintenance of Bitcoin Core to higher-level research and chose Vladimir van der Laan as his successor. Van der Laan was an active contributor to Bitcoin's code, but he ended up being the most passive of the 3 project leaders, allowing critical decisions to go unresolved. Shortly after Andreessen made van der Laan the lead maintainer of Bitcoin Core, the internal factions became more entrenched and hostile towards each other. Van der Laan was an active contributor to Bitcoin's code, but he ended up being the most passive of the 3 project leaders, allowing critical decisions to go unresolved. Shortly after Andreessen made van der Laan the lead maintainer of Bitcoin Core, the internal factions became more entrenched and hostile towards each other. and the block size debate went nuclear. Several key core developers formed their own company called Blockstream, which has been, by far, the most influential company involved with Bitcoin software development and plays a central role in its capture. Several prominent developers publicly warned that BTC was being hijacked while it was happening. During this period of extreme division, the general public remained mostly unaware, and in late 2017, another enormous wave of investment caused prices to spike amidst the chaos. One BTC eventually reached $20,000, while the average transaction fee spiked to more than $50, and average transaction confirmation times exceeded 2 weeks. Blockstream executive Samson Mow captured this sentiment by flatly declaring that Bitcoin isn't for people that live on less than $2 a day. The new narrative started to solidify with books like the Bitcoin Standard, which, despite making blunders on several critical concepts, has enjoyed widespread popularity. The same ideas have been uniformly repeated on all the most important discussion channels, making the small block philosophy the only perspective that newcomers encounter when learning about Bitcoin. The original vision of big blocks and universal access to the blockchain was successfully demonized and its history obfuscated. The culture is obsessively focused on the price of BTC, regardless of its underlying utility or usage. For example, when the El Salvador government announced that BTC was going to become an official currency, there was almost no mention of the fact that their government was setting up purely custodial wallets for their citizens, meaning the government will be able to track and censor transactions made through their app, freeze accounts, or easily confiscate coins if they decide to. Nobody thought that a maximum throughput limit of 7 transactions per second was a good idea. That is, not until 2013, when developer Peter Todd put out an animated video entitled "Why the Block Size Limit Keeps Bitcoin Free and Decentralized." I consider Peter Todd's animation to be the first example of well-funded, blatant propaganda. It's so outrageous that it stretches credulity to think it was created from a mere difference in philosophy.
We have an alternative to increasing the block size: off-chain transactions. The block size stays the same, and mining stays decentralized. You'll still use the blockchain for large transactions. Small exchanges will be handled by payment processors, which means small purchases like your morning coffee don't clog the whole system up. We can use the very same cryptography that makes Bitcoin secure to audit off-chain payment systems, as well as effectively make it impossible to get away with fraud or theft. Imagine a plexiglass bank where you can easily observe the inner workings. Unlike the completely public blockchain where you can't pick who mines your transactions or who you trust to do validation, off-chain transactions can be both instant, truly private, and you have complete control over who to trust. What can you do to keep Bitcoin decentralized? If you're a miner, only mine at pools that support the block size limit and ask your pool to publicly say so. If you are a user, ignore anyone trying to change the Bitcoin software you use to increase the 1 megabyte block size, and tell people you transact with that you support keeping Bitcoin decentralized and out of the hands of the existing corporate system. Remember, Bitcoin is democratic, and the only way the block size can change is if we agree to let that happen.
Peter Todd's slick, misleading video was a milestone in Bitcoin's history, and it wasn't the only thing he did in 2013 that raised suspicions. In the online forums, Peter Todd posted a thread entitled, "Reminder, ZeroConf is not safe. 1,000 USD reward posted for replaced by fee patch," in which he wrote, "Someone by the name of John Dillon emailed the Bitcoin development email list earlier this morning offering a 500 USD reward, later increased to 1,000, to anyone who implements a transaction replacement by fee patch." That's an idea I posted on the email list 2 days ago. Peter Todd proposed the Replace by Fee, RBF patch, which said that when 2 conflicting transactions are seen, the one with the higher fee wins. In his mind, ZeroConf transactions aren't safe enough, and uninformed users just don't realize it. So, to prevent people from getting attached to ZeroConf transactions, RBF would break their functionality once and for all. Because in his words, if the miners decided to implement something like RBF, ZeroConf would break anyway. replaced by fee, prompted many people to speak out against it. Charlie Lee, who was the engineering manager at Coinbase, said, "Coinbase fully agrees with Mike Hearn. RBF is irrational and harmful to Bitcoin." Even Adam Back, who later played a big role in derailing Bitcoin, agreed, "I agree with Mike and Jeff. Blowing up zero confirmed transactions is vandalism." Yet in late 2015, RBF was successfully added to Bitcoin Core. Zero-conf payments are understood to be an essential feature in Bitcoin Cash, and developers have been actively working on ways to further improve their security and reliability. In November 2013, Dillon was apparently hacked by some angry Bitcoiners when his Bitcoin Talk account posted its own thread entitled, "John Dillon, we can leak things too, you trolling piece of shit." The post contained a single link to an archive of private correspondence from Dillon, as well as conversations about him from other developers. The authenticity of the leak has not been disputed. Dillon appears to be coordinating with Todd and funding multiple projects that supported transforming Bitcoin into an expensive settlement system. By far the most interesting exchange is an email between Dillon and Todd, in which Dillon claims to be involved with the intelligence community, saying, "Just so you know, this stuff about Tor has me worried. Please don't make this public, but my day job involves intelligence, and I'm in a relatively high position." These emails read like something out of a spy novel. It's impossible to know whether Dillon was telling the truth, but it's worth noting how suspicious the whole situation is. All of this happened around the most revolutionary financial invention in history, which directly challenges established governmental, financial, and banking powers around the world. Readers can come to their own conclusions, but in my mind, by late 2013, Bitcoin had already been targeted for capture. Blockstream would end up being the most influential company in Bitcoin's history. Blockstream was founded as a for-profit company, a fact that made other Bitcoiners immediately curious about their business model. Shortly after its formation, the culture shifted, disagreements turned hostile, and the most radical small block position, which hardly anybody had taken seriously, became more vocal and aggressive. Blockstream engineers started to insist that Bitcoin could not scale the way it was originally designed, while censorship began in the online forums. In a Forbes interview, CEO Adam Back shared one part of their monetization strategy, saying, "Blockstream plans to sell side chains to enterprises, charging a fixed monthly fee, taking transaction fees, and even selling hardware." Blockstream has released their version of a sidechain called the Liquid Network. The Liquid Network is a federated sidechain, which is better understood as a centralized sidechain or even an altcoin. The basic security of their network requires trust in a small, hand-selected group they call the Liquid Federation. In early 2016, eyebrows were raised when Blockstream completed a $55 million round of Series A funding. One of the primary investors was XIII Strategic Ventures, a branch of the French multinational firm AXA. At the time, the CEO of AXA was Henri de Castries, a magnate of the international financial system. De Castries was also chairman of the Bilderberg Group, a collection of political and business leaders from Europe and North America that meets in private every year to debate megatrends and major issues facing the world. When Blockstream was created, their initial funding came from establishment financial companies, including MasterCard, a direct competitor of Bitcoin. The Digital Currency Group is another venture capital firm which has raised suspicions after investing in a huge range of cryptocurrency projects, Blockstream included. Early Bitcoin adopter and internet personality Stefan Molyneux had this concern as early as 2014 when he predicted that existing financial and political interests would recognize Bitcoin as a threat and try to slowly capture it.
My caution, my advice, my concern is that what I see in the Bitcoin community is quite a bit of optimism, and I would also a little bit of political naivete. I think it's really, really important to understand how big the behemoth is that Bitcoin is facing. There will, of course, be efforts made on the part of the financial government complex to keep the technology at bay. Now, my guess is that they don't and they won't. I would say, well, let's not kill it completely. Let's not kill it outright. Because it's big enough now that people will see what we've done, and it really disturbs the villagers when a body falls from the sky. So what they're going to try and do is they're just going to try and not take out the revving engine with an airstrike, but just throw little bits of sand in it, little bits of sand in it, little bits of sand in it, until most people find it too difficult and cumbersome to use, and then say, well, it was an interesting idea, just didn't quite work out the way that people wanted.
Low fees are also critical to the long-term success of programmable money. The attitude towards high fees has shifted today, but originally even a 5-cent transaction fee was considered laughably high. In a famous interview, Vitalik Buterin commented,
right now a Bitcoin transaction costs 5 cents, which is fine right now because PayPal's fees are even stupider, but the internet of money should not cost 5 cents a transaction. It's kind of absurd.
Nobody captured this sentiment better than Mike Hearn in a public email thread with Greg Maxwell. Hearn started the email by quoting Maxwell, who was trying to argue that tiny blocks were always the plan from the beginning. Look, it's clear you have decided that the way Bitcoin was meant to evolve isn't to your personal liking. That's fine. Go make an altcoin where your founding documents state that it's intended to always run on a 2015 Raspberry Pi or whatever it is you mean by small device. Remove SPV capability from the protocol so everyone has to fully validate. Make sure that's the understanding that everyone has from day one about what your altcoin is for. Then when someone says, gee, it'd be nice if we had some more capacity, you or someone else can go point at the announcement emails and say, no, GregCoin is meant to always be verifiable on small devices. That's our social contract, and it's written into the consensus rules for that reason. But your attempt to convert Bitcoin into that altcoin by exploiting a temporary hack is desperate and deeply upsetting to many people. Not many quit their jobs and created companies to build products only for today's tiny user base. Nobody put it better than Mike Hearn, then or now. After seeing the failures of Bitcoin and what it's turned into today, I think Hearn's anger and frustration were justified, and he was certainly not alone. Andreas Antonopoulos, who has since become a popular advocate for Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, also expressed his frustration at the behavior of the core developers and Mr. Maxwell in particular. Maxwell has previously posted several misattributed quotes and then failed to retract them or apologize. The only thing that mattered in this debate was the opinion of the 3 to 4 developers who did not want any process that resulted in anything but what they had already decided. They twisted, turned, and rationalized, but in the end did exactly what they intended from the beginning: censorship of particular opinions by exclusion and decree. All hail our new overlords. They're not just coders, they are press directors and own Bitcoin. As they often say, if you don't like it, fork. Mike Hearn and Gavin Anderson had previously created an alternative implementation called BitcoinXT to make some non-critical changes to the software. It was this alternative implementation that was chosen to be the big block replacement of Bitcoin Core. The block size limit would be increased on BitcoinXT, making it incompatible with Core, and if a critical mass of miners used it, the network would be successfully upgraded at long last to allow for larger blocks. Satoshi described this upgrade mechanism in the Whitepaper, stating, "Proof of work also solves the problem of determining representation in majority decision-making. Proof of work is essentially one CPU, one vote. The majority decision is represented by the longest chain, which has the greatest proof of work effort invested in it. Miners vote with their CPU power, expressing their acceptance of valid blocks by working on extending them, and rejecting invalid blocks by refusing to work on them. Any needed rules and incentives can be enforced with this consensus mechanism. BIP 101 was considered a hard fork upgrade because it would be incompatible with previous versions of the software, as opposed to a soft fork, which maintains compatibility. Peter Willa from Bitcoin Core stated, "If we are willing to go through the risk of a hard fork because of a fear of change of economics, then I believe the Bitcoin community is not ready to deal with change at all. In hindsight, the drama surrounding hard forks looks overblown. Nearly every cryptocurrency project undergoes hard forks because they are an essential mechanism for upgrading critical code, fixing bugs, and reducing technical baggage. Ethereum regularly undergoes hard forks. Bitcoin Cash has undergone several since its release. But back in 2015, this precedent was not yet established, and Core was able to stoke fears that a hard fork could break the network. With the widespread international agreement that the block size limit must be raised, the power and influence of Bitcoin Core looked like it was coming to an end. If a supermajority of miners followed Hearn and Anderson, the small block vision of Bitcoin would be relegated to an altcoin, and the core developers would effectively be fired. So there was an immediate widespread campaign to shut down XT before it gained too much momentum. BTC's powerful narrative, repeated everywhere in the media, did not spontaneously emerge, nor was it the result of free and open discussion among Bitcoin enthusiasts. The two most important discussion platforms on which the overwhelming majority of conversations happened were BitcoinTalk.org and the r/Bitcoin subreddit. Both platforms happened to be controlled by the same person, known by the pseudonym Thamos, who also owns the Bitcoin Wiki. That's one person with enormous power to shape narratives and direct the flow of information. And when the time came, he was not hesitant to exercise this power. In August 2015, Thamos announced a new moderation policy on r/Bitcoin that censored all discussion of BitcoinXT. The key message was that all hard forks are illegitimate without a consensus of core developers. Because of this, BitcoinXT was not really Bitcoin, and therefore could no longer be discussed on the platform. I know almost for certain that there is no consensus to the change in XT because Bitcoin core developers, Vladimir, Greg, and Peter are opposed to it. That's enough to block consensus. This isn't some democratic country where you can always get your way with sufficient politicking. Get consensus, live without the change, or create your own altcoin. The Bitcoin community was livid. Thamos' announcement was another dark milestone in Bitcoin's history, and it generated a huge reaction. The thread accumulated more than 1,000 comments. Thamos was not shy about his decision, and he revealed his censorship strategy in conversation that would eventually be leaked. You must be naive if you think it'll have no effect. I've moderated forums since long before Bitcoin, some quite large, and I know how moderation affects people. Long-term banning XT from r/Bitcoin will hurt XT's chances to hijack Bitcoin. There's still a chance, but it's smaller. This is improved by the simultaneous action on BitcoinTalk.org, Bitcoin.it, and Bitcoin.org. I do have power over certain centralized websites, which I've decided to use for the benefit of Bitcoin as a whole. The decision to censor all discussion of BitcoinXT did not just infuriate regular Bitcoiners, it also upset fellow moderators. A few days after Thamos' announcement, a dissident moderator, J. Ratcliffe 63367, wrote a sharply critical article. Only 10 days after his public criticism of Thamos, he was removed as a moderator from r/Bitcoin. Unfortunately, mass censorship and propaganda were not the only tactics used against BitcoinXT. The core developers were not happy about the idea of letting miners decide what the main software implementation should be. Just like with the block size limit, they argued that it would harm Bitcoin's decentralization. Hearn pointed out that without such a mechanism, the obvious threat to decentralization would be Core's monopoly over the protocol. Right now, the people doing the most to hurt decentralization of Bitcoin are Blockstream and Vladimir, by telling people that using the blockchain as a voting mechanism, as was done in the past, is reckless and will destroy Bitcoin's value. The logical implication of this argument is that only Bitcoin core developers, and really only Vladimir, can change big chunks of the Bitcoin protocol, and thus that they are effectively the CEOs of Bitcoin, which is the opposite of decentralization. A moderator of r/Bitcoin, user hardleft121, reacted positively to Hearn's post, saying that everyone should read this. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Mike and Gavin are right. Hardleft121 was also removed from his position as a moderator by Thamos. Brian Armstrong was interviewed by Bitcoin Magazine about Coinbase's position with regards to BIP 101 and BitcoinXT. He responded, "In my view, BitcoinXT is the best option I've seen so far. Not just because it has working code, but also because it has a simple implementation that is easy to understand. The block size increases seem about right to me, and I have confidence in the people behind the project. We will upgrade regardless of whether Bitcoin Core is updated." I've been disappointed to see how slow Bitcoin Core has moved on this issue, and we're open to switching forks. The day that interview was published, it was linked to on r/Bitcoin, upsetting Thamos, who immediately warned that Coinbase could be punished and censored from the online forums for their act of disobedience. If Coinbase promotes XT to customers on Coinbase.com and/or switches all of its full nodes to BIP 101 software, then Coinbase is no longer using the Bitcoin currency, and it doesn't belong on our Bitcoin. This also applies to BitcoinTalk.org, where Coinbase would be restricted to the altcoin section. Bitcoin.it and Bitcoin.org have similar policies. In December 2015, Coinbase announced that they were running BitcoinXT on their servers and supporting BitcoinXT, though they were still open to other proposals. In response, the owners of Bitcoin.org promptly removed Coinbase from their website, a remarkable move considering that Coinbase might have onboarded more people to Bitcoin than any other company in the world. The removal was made by one of the owners of Bitcoin.org, another shadowy figure known by the pseudonym Cobra, who stated, "Coinbase is now running BitcoinXT in their production servers. XT is a contentious hard fork attempt that will create a new altcoin and split the community and blockchain should it ever go into effect. If this ever happens, Coinbase's customers may find that they no longer own any actual Bitcoin." This announcement again raised the ire of many Bitcoiners. Developer Jameson Lopp wrote, "The potential for forking does not an altcoin make. Until such time as a BIP 101 fork occurs, companies running XT are definitely running Bitcoin. If a hard fork does occur, said companies may still be running Bitcoin. It would have to be judged which fork is the winner post-fork. Removing companies as not running Bitcoin when no fork has occurred is jumping the gun." Bitcoin veteran Olivier Janssens claimed that the move was retaliation for Coinbase having dared to speak up against CoreDev. There is something funny about the use of the term consensus to describe the position of a handful of core developers as opposed to the overwhelming majority of industry participants. If there was any actual consensus in 2015, it was that the block size limit needed to be raised immediately. BitcoinXT posed a real threat to small blockers, so they attacked it, claiming it risked the integrity of the entire Bitcoin network. Because the core developers did not approve, XT was deemed controversial and therefore too risky or even reckless for anyone to support. Yet this way of upgrading Bitcoin was described by Satoshi himself all the way back in 2010. It can be phased in, like if block number greater than 115,000, max block size equals larger limit. It can start being in versions way ahead, so by the time it reaches that block number and goes into effect, the older versions that don't have it are already obsolete. When we're near the cutoff block number, I can put an alert to old versions to make sure they know they have to upgrade. Satoshi's method was simple and straightforward, as usual. He recommended creating a hard fork upgrade that would increase the block size limit at a predetermined time in the future. Despite the open support for larger blocks, in BIP 101 in particular, some miners started to get cold feet due to the controversy created by core supporters. Ant Pool, a mining pool accounting for roughly 20% of the hash rate at the time, stated, "We like the idea of increasing the maximum block size, but if BitcoinXT is too contentious, we also don't want the community to be divided. It's not hard to understand why miners would prefer the easiest option, which would have been core coming to their senses and raising the block size limit. The entire industry desired the same thing, which is why it took years before BitcoinXT was created. However, as time went on, it became clear that Core would not change their minds, and to believe otherwise was simply wishful thinking. Bitcoin Core would find another way to obfuscate and delay by organizing a series of scaling Bitcoin conferences that tried to persuade miners to keep running Core's software. At these conferences, they agreed that the block size limit had to be raised, but only to 2 megabytes instead of 8 megabytes. Miners were urged to keep trusting Core and wait a little longer for more substantial upgrades. In August 2015, the CEO of Blockstream, Adam Back, wrote, "My suggestion, 2 megabyte now, then 4 megabyte in 2 years, and 8 megabyte in 4 years, then reasses." And later in December of that year added, "There is consensus from developers, miners that 2 megabyte is next step." Over the following years, this 2 megabyte compromise was agreed to several times, with Core ultimately breaking their agreements every time. When XT failed, Mike Hearn considered it a demonstration that Bitcoin could not overcome the human, social, and psychological barriers limiting its own success. He would later write, "That was the point where I decided it had all become a waste of my time. The vast majority of mining hash power was controlled by people who were psychologically incapable of disobedience to perceived authority." On January 14, 2016, Hearn penned the last of his excellent essays entitled The Resolution of the Bitcoin Experiment. In it, he explained why he considered Bitcoin a failed project. It has failed because the community has failed. What was meant to be a new, decentralized form of money that lacked systemically important institutions and too big to fail has become something even worse, a system completely controlled by just a handful of people. There's no longer much reason to think Bitcoin can actually be better than the existing financial system. At the beginning of 2016, more than 90% of the network hash rate expressed support for increasing the block size limit to at least 2 megabytes. While BitcoinXT was not chosen as the implementation to make the increase happen, another quickly took its place. Bitcoin Classic, led by Gavin Anderson and Jeff Garzik, immediately gained popularity as a conservative alternative to Bitcoin Core by only increasing the limit to 2 megabytes. Like XT, Classic would increase the block size limit only after reaching a threshold of 75% of the hash rate. Just days after Classic's website was created, 50% of the hash rate stated their support for the new implementation. Despite its instant popularity, not everybody was ready to fork away from Core. The strategy of waiting for Core to increase the block size was not one with a good track record. Eric Voorhees, the creator of the extremely popular Satoshi dice game and the Shapeshift exchange, would comment on BTCC's position, urging them to support Classic, if only to pressure Core into compromise. The only circumstance under which Core would go to 2 megabytes is if they feel an imminent hard fork toward Classic or something else. If your desire is to get Core to add 2 megabytes, signing on to Classic is probably the most effective sick path. By the end of February 2016, it looked like the pressure was starting to work. An emergency conference was organized in Hong Kong with several large miners, companies, and key Core developers. On February 20th, an agreement was reached, now called the Hong Kong Agreement. The two key components were a hard fork upgrade to raise the block size limit to 2 megabytes, a soft fork upgrade to enable SegWit. Brian Armstrong was a notable critic, and he flew back from Hong Kong convinced that Bitcoin Core needed to be replaced as soon as possible. Some Core developers and Adam Back have stated that Bitcoin is not a democracy. While this description is correct for the current governance model, with the censorship, character assassinations, attacks against anyone who disagrees with the party line, and sabotage against free choice, the current governance is more similar to North Korea. The magazine Cointelegraph covered the story of F2 Pool, a Chinese mining pool accounting for more than a quarter of Bitcoin's total hash rate, being attacked immediately after allowing their miners to run Classic. The attacks began to target the F2 Pool Bitcoin mining pool almost immediately after the F2 Pool team announced their decision to test Bitcoin Classic by launching a sub-pool in which miners can mine Bitcoin Classic blocks. Once again, the attacks proved remarkably effective. Bitcoin Classic enjoyed its highest support around the middle of March 2016 before rapidly declining. So to a large number of miners, trusting Core seemed like a safer option. Unfortunately, their trust was misplaced, and Brian Armstrong's criticisms would prove prescient. The Core developers missed their deadlines for both the SegWit upgrade and block size increase. They did not adhere to the Hong Kong Agreement, and the blocks kept getting fuller. Meanwhile, the war to control Bitcoin's dominant narrative was raging. Rampant censorship was not the most extreme tactic used. The owners of key informational websites became even more brazen. In July 2016, the Bitcoin.org owner Cobra came up with an idea. Perhaps newcomers could be prevented from learning about Bitcoin's original design by changing the white paper itself. I feel like the Bitcoin described in the paper and the Bitcoin described on Bitcoin.org are starting to diverge. At some point, I think the paper will start to do more harm than good because it tricks people into believing they understand Bitcoin. Cobra then makes the extraordinary claim that the white paper is not meant to explain Satoshi's original design, but rather to explain how the present Bitcoin core software works. I have seen people promote toxic and crazy ideas and then cite parts of the paper in an effort to justify it. Academics are also regularly citing the paper and basing some of their reasoning and arguments on this outdated paper. By Cobra's logic, even if the core developers wildly change the code to lose all resemblance to the original Bitcoin, the white paper should be altered to reflect those changes. Theymos immediately commented on the thread, agreeing that the white paper misleads people. Interesting suggestion. The paper is definitely outdated, and I do often see people saying, just read the white paper, as if the paper is still a good way to learn about Bitcoin. Fortunately, this proposal was met with sufficient resistance to block the change, though it would not stop them from trying again in the future. Theymos would later make another outrageous proposal that companies should be required to pledge their allegiance to the small blocker narrative in order to have their products listed on the Bitcoin.org website. Cobra chimed in, again criticizing the white paper and calling for it to be revised or replaced altogether. The white paper is to blame for all these dangerous beliefs. We seriously need to rewrite it or produce a completely new white paper and call that the Bitcoin white paper. Two unknown people who control the most prominent websites in Bitcoin are eager to censor, propagandize, and even rewrite history to push their narrative. The average user does not even know of the existence of Theymos and Cobra, much less so the history of how they pushed a version of Bitcoin that is diametrically opposed to the original one. Neither do prominent investors that I have spoken with in private, because it takes significant independent research or long-term involvement in the industry to figure out. 2016 came and went without SegWit or a block size increase, and the next year would become the craziest in Bitcoin's history. In January 2017, blocks were regularly running at 90% plus capacity, occasionally bumping into the 1 megabyte limit, and by March, the average transaction fee passed $1. Early Bitcoin entrepreneur Charlie Shrem wrote, "If we don't implement bigger blocks ASAP, PayPal will be cheaper on Bitcoin. I already pay a few dollars per TX. Stop hindering growth." The next alternative implementation started to gain steam. The Bitcoin Unlimited BU team wanted to replace the hard-coded block size limit with emergent consensus. The basic idea was simply to allow miners and nodes to set their own limit without needing approval from anyone. Economic incentives were strong enough to keep the network coordinated and functional. Despite gaining momentum in early 2017, BU was hated by the typical characters and attacked. On Reddit, multiple anonymous users shared their intentions to exploit any bugs they could find for maximum effect. They succeeded, and in the middle of March, over half the Bitcoin Unlimited nodes were successfully brought down in a coordinated attack. The bug did not cause much damage itself, but it did damage the reputation of BU at a critical time. A Bloomberg article covering the attacks wrote, "Unlimited had in recent weeks won the backing of influential miners, as some decided to give up on reaching a community consensus after more than 2 years of discussion. The bug raises uncertainty about whether miners will follow through on their support." Another conference was organized, this time in New York. The largest economic players were invited, along with key core developers. An agreement was quickly reached, a conservative one, resembling the Hong Kong agreement that was previously agreed upon. SegWit would be activated with an 80% miner threshold, and a 2 megabyte block size increase would happen within 6 months. This would become known as the New York Agreement. The overwhelming majority of the industry agreed that upgrading Bitcoin's capacity was urgent, but the Bitcoin core developers were absolutely unwilling to increase the block size limit at all. So, other developers would have to make it happen on a different software repository. Jeff Garzik was chosen as the lead developer for this new project, and the code he was working on would be called SegWit 2x or S2x. Once again, Core was at risk of being fired. If the majority of miners running SegWit 2x produced a block larger than 1 megabyte, the miners running Core would be forked off the network. Perhaps more importantly, the keys to Bitcoin's code would finally be ripped from Core's hands. So another campaign was waged to demonize anybody supporting SegWit 2x. Greg Maxwell wrote, "A couple of well-meaning dipshits went to China a few months back to learn and educate about the issues and managed to let themselves get locked in a room until 3 to 4 a.m. until they would personally agree to propose some hard fork after SegWit. Despite claiming for years in the name of unity that a fork should be avoided at all costs, core supporters demonstrated that they had no real desire for cooperation. When the time came, they were ready to divide the community and attack their opponents by whatever means necessary. If SegWit turned out to be a bad idea, or if its adoption caused a chain split, or if the 2x block size increase failed to occur, there had to be a plan B. So an alternative implementation was created to safely split off from BTC and form a separate chain without SegWit and with an immediate increase of the block size limit to 8 megabytes. This implementation was called Bitcoin ABC, the ABC standing for Adjustable Block Size Cap, which would allow miners to set their own limits without needing the approval of developers. Bitcoin ABC brought about a new network, and therefore a new coin, called Bitcoin Cash. That's how BCH started, not as an immediate replacement for BTC, but as a contingency plan by the biggest miners in case the BTC upgrades failed. It turned out to be a good idea. Instead of avoiding forks, Bitcoin looked like it would split into 3 different chains by the end of 2017. The SegWit 1x chain, S1x, the SegWit 2x chain, S2x, and Bitcoin Cash, BCH. The name Bitcoin would be assigned to whichever chain accumulated the most hash rate, regardless of whether it was S1x or S2x. By September 2017, roughly 95% of the hash rate was signaling for S2x, practically guaranteeing that the Bitcoin name, ticker symbol, and network effects would go with the 2 megabyte chain. Core became even more aggressive and tried to get the government involved. Core developer Eric Lombroso called S2X a serious cyber attack and threatened to take legal action against it, stating, "A good portion of the community wants to keep the legacy chain. Attempts to destroy it will be treated as an attack on the property of all these people. It constitutes a serious cyber attack and decisive action against it, both technical and legal, has been prepared." Blockstream co-founder Matt Corallo wrote directly to the SEC to ask them to intervene and provide consumer protection from the fork. Samson Mow took to Twitter, suggesting that Coinbase was breaking the laws of the BIT license in New York. Tagging both Coinbase and the New York Department of Financial Services, he wrote, "Is that Coinbase breaking the terms of BIT license?" Endorsing 2x fork definitely raises safety concerns. In addition to lawsuit threats, they also used more direct ways of attacking businesses that did not define Bitcoin by Bitcoin Core software. Wallet providers, for example, could face waves of fake one-star reviews on their apps, warning users of potential lost funds or malware because their company would not support the real Bitcoin. Another round of DDoS attacks started against the New York Agreement supporters. The constant demonizations, character assassinations, and online harassment extended even to people who were guilty of associating with declared enemies. When Bitcoin.org was discussing the removal of the BTC.com wallet from their website, Cobra responded, "They're associated with that monster Jihan Wu, so I don't mind if they get removed because of this. They're terrible people." I definitely feel like a line has been crossed here. Jihan Wu is the co-founder of Bitmain, the largest chip manufacturer for Bitcoin miners. He was also the first person to translate the Whitepaper into Chinese. Despite getting involved in 2011 and building one of the most successful Bitcoin companies in the world, Wu was smeared as a monster for his lack of total obedience to Bitcoin Core. In fact, since nearly all the miners were supporting S2X instead of Core, the narrative quickly shifted to outright hostility towards miners generally, as if SegWit 2x was a miner takeover of Bitcoin. The proper role of miners was no longer to protect, secure, and scale the network. It was to quietly run software provided to them by the core developers. Amid the controversy and confusion, the cryptocurrency exchange, Bitfinex, found a way to raise the costs of following through with SegWit 2x. Unlike most of the industry, they decided that the ticker symbol, BTC, would not be assigned based on hash rate. Instead, it would be given to the incumbent implementation, Their announcement read, "We have elected to designate the SegWit 2x fork as B2X for now. The incumbent implementation based on the existing Bitcoin consensus protocol will continue to trade as BTC even if the B2X chain has more hashing power. For the time being, BTC will continue to be labeled as Bitcoin, and B2X will be labeled as B2X. This will remain the case unless and until such time that market forces suggest an alternative, more appropriate, labeling scheme for one or both chains. A few other smaller exchanges would soon follow the same policy. That meant users could find themselves trading BTC for one price on BitfineX, a wildly different price on Coinbase, and payment processors like BitPay might not even recognize their coins at all. Essentially a nightmare scenario for the average user. On November 8, 2017, roughly a week before the planned fork, BitPay wrote a letter calling for the cancellation of SegWit 2X. Shortly afterwards, a joint announcement was made by some of its strongest backers, including the lead developer, Jeff Garzik. Our goal has always been a smooth upgrade for Bitcoin. Although we strongly believe in the need for a larger block size, there is something we believe is even more important: keeping the community together. Unfortunately, it is clear that we have not built sufficient consensus for a clean block size upgrade at this time. Continuing on the current path could divide the community and be a setback to Bitcoin's growth. This was never the goal of SegWit 2X. As fees rise on the blockchain, we believe it will eventually become obvious that on-chain capacity increases are necessary. When that happens, we hope the community will come together and find a solution, possibly with a block size increase. Until then, we are suspending our plans for the upcoming 2 megabyte upgrade. And with that, the New York agreement failed, just like the Hong Kong agreement did before it, and like Bitcoin Unlimited, Classic, and XT before that. The failure of S2X would demonstrate, once and for all, that Bitcoin Core had totally captured BTC and would permanently overhaul its design. Anybody adhering to the original vision for Bitcoin as digital cash would be forced to move to a different project. Bitcoin Cash immediately provided that outlet as Big Block Bitcoin, without the burdens of Blockstream and the core developers. 3 days after the cancellation of SegWit 2X, Gavin Anderson identified BCH as the continuation of the original Bitcoin project. Bitcoin Cash is what I started working on in 2010, a store of value and means of exchange. Bitcoin's darkest time was during its Civil War era, and it resulted in a successful hijack of the original project. But fortunately, its story does not end there. Maximalists will insist that the battle for Bitcoin is over, that the core developers are now the final authority, and that the price appreciation of BTC has vindicated the small block philosophy. None of these things are true. Bitcoin technology is still new, and with big blocks, it can compete against any cash system in the world. The core developers might control BTC, but they do not have any control over BCH. The price of each coin depends on the quality of information within the economy. If misinformation is currently widespread, then prices are destined to adjust as better information becomes known. Bitcoin's original, ambitious goal was to be a fast, cheap, reliable payment system for the internet without needing to trust a centralized authority. That project is alive and well. It just got delayed a few years. Immediately after the failure of SegWit 2X, there was a real possibility that Bitcoin Cash would simply replace BTC as the real Bitcoin. Within a month, the price of BCH went from around $650 to an intraday high of over $4,000. For a brief period, it looked like Bitcoin was going to free itself from Core once and for all. The momentum did not continue, however, and in the face of suffocating information control, the price of BCH has steadily decreased relative to BTC for the past few years. Bitcoin Core supporters are eager to declare a victory because of the large price difference between the two coins. But this is premature. The higher price of BTC is almost entirely due to the inheritance of network effects, not because people were excited about small blocks. Since years later, there is still hardly anybody who understands the difference between big and small blocks. The most potent weapon in the arsenal of BTC maximalists has always been narrative control. So immediately they went to work using their old tactics of smearing people and directing the flow of information online. Bitcoin Jesus was inverted to Bitcoin Judas. A campaign was created to only refer to Bitcoin Cash as Bcash to discredit and distance BCH from the Bitcoin brand. Honest discussion about Bitcoin Cash was once again heavily suppressed and often censored outright. Having seen these tactics before, many big blockers assumed the Bcash campaign was coordinated by the same bad actors, and leaked conversations strengthened that suspicion. In a Slack conversation between Adam Back and Cobra, the pseudonymous co-owner of the Bitcoin.org domain, Back tries to convince Cobra to hand over the domain to somebody else because he accuses Cobra of being secretly sympathetic to the big block philosophy. To make his case, Back points out that Cobra just said Bcash has advantages and didn't call it Bcash, as if merely not using the term Bcash was suspicious behavior. BCH developer Jonald Fuchbal wrote an article summarizing his thoughts about the motivation behind the Bcash campaign. He explained, it's simple. They want to disassociate Bitcoin Cash from Bitcoin. They are hoping new users won't even realize there's another version of Bitcoin. They are hoping those users won't realize that Bitcoin was originally peer-to-peer electronic cash, not the settlement layer that Core is pushing. And ultimately, they are hoping people don't see that Bitcoin has changed course, and that there's a version of Bitcoin that stayed with the original formula. The Bitcoin maximalist playbook should be clear by now. Relentlessly push a narrative and attack anybody that questions it. Censor discussion and revise history if necessary. Utilize social media to harass, shame, and bully people into submission. Anybody willing to dig beneath the surface will quickly find holes in their story. While there are endless examples of outrageous, deceptive behavior, not every criticism of Bitcoin Cash comes from bad actors. Information has been tightly controlled online for several years, so most people are simply confused because they have only heard one side of the story. The developers are bad. For the first year after the Bitcoin Cash fork, this was one of the most popular smears against BCH, but it has become notably less common since an event in late 2018 when a BCH developer named Almany discovered a catastrophic bug in the Bitcoin Core software. Of all the possible bugs in Bitcoin, inflation bugs are one of the worst. If exploited, it could have allowed somebody to secretly create new coins out of thin air. Almany was so shocked by the severity of the bug and the fact that it passed peer review from people like von der Laan and Greg Maxwell that he wondered whether it was intentional. Almany discovered this bug in September 2018. Despite experiencing the hostility of the core developers for years, he decided to disclose the bug to them privately and not exploit it for financial gain. He could have seriously damaged the reputation of Bitcoin Core and the credibility of BTC, but chose not to. His goodwill was not returned, and instead of gratitude, his disclosure was met with more criticism, and the individuals involved refused to take responsibility for the catastrophic bug. After this event, maximalists still refused to give Almany the respect he deserved, but it did quiet down claims that Bitcoin Core had a monopoly on all the competent developers. Forking away from Bitcoin Core allowed the Bitcoin Cash developers to improve more than just the block size limit. Other features that Satoshi built into the original design have been reactivated, and other innovations have improved BCH's capacity to create smart contracts, seamlessly issue tokens, and maximize transaction privacy. Entrepreneurs and developers now have more tools available for them to build directly on Bitcoin without having to worry about their product breaking due to the extreme limitations of small blocks. Freed from Bitcoin Core's roadmap, the BCH developers could finally return to the original focus and purpose of Bitcoin. The controversial replace by fee feature was removed, making instant transactions much more reliable for merchants and payment processors. Schnorr signatures led to the creation of Cash Fusion, a privacy protocol that offers a practical way to recombine fragmented anonymous transactions in a secure way without the server being able to steal the funds or de-anonymize users. Cash tokens enables decentralized applications on BCH in a similar fashion to the Ethereum network, with the added scalability of big block Bitcoin. Researchers have long been interested in pushing the limits of on-chain scaling. Bitcoin Cash already has a 32 megabyte block size limit, but that's obviously not sufficient for global adoption. All the way back in 2017, Dr. Peter Riesen used the BCH testnet, a sandbox for testing without affecting the main chain, and successfully mined a 1 gigabyte block. Given the pace of development of computer technology, Satoshi's statement that it never really hits a scale ceiling looks correct. Far from the claims of Bitcoin Core supporters, the original Bitcoin has extreme scaling capability, and it is finally being realized on the Bitcoin Cash network. Every cryptocurrency has supporters that loudly proclaim that their coin is superior for one reason or another. Instead of making abstract arguments or a marketing pitch, I strongly suggest readers experiment with Bitcoin Cash for themselves. The fees are extremely low, which means you will not lose a bunch of money in transaction fees by playing around. The experience is so good when compared to other projects, it speaks for itself. Most people simply do not know the story of Bitcoin Core. They do not know that blockchains can scale just fine, and that the Bitcoin network was intentionally redesigned to have high fees. They do not know that Blockstream profits by diverting traffic onto their own proprietary blockchain. They do not know about the failures of the Lightning Network and the inevitable proliferation of custodial wallets. They do not know that the information they consume online has been tightly controlled and censored for years to promote a single, dominant narrative. But they are totally on board with the idea of sound digital money that is not controlled by a centralized authority. A beautiful vision that simply cannot be realized on the BTC network. So in one sense, despite the widespread misinformation, the hardest sell is already done. Switching from one blockchain to another is easy compared to getting sold on the idea of cryptocurrencies in the first place. We are at the beginning of a monetary revolution. From a historical perspective, the blockchain is still a brand new invention. And like any powerful new technology, it can make the world a considerably better or worse place. If we are not careful, it might be co-opted and used to track and control people at an unprecedented level. But if we unlock its potential for good, it will usher in a new era of sound money, personal freedom, and prosperity. The benefits of sound digital money are enormous as the risks of unsound digital money. Transactions that are not peer-to-peer require third parties to facilitate them, and the old financial system is largely composed of third parties: banks, payment processors, credit card companies, regulatory agencies, and central banks manipulating the money supply. Middlemen are everywhere, profiting in some way from every transaction they touch. Satoshi's version of Bitcoin, used for everyday commerce, with large blocks and universal access to the blockchain, routes around these intermediaries. We may never know the true motivation behind Bitcoin Core's decision to overhaul Satoshi's design. Maybe it happened in good faith. Maybe it happened because Core was infiltrated. Regardless, the result is the same: a small block version of Bitcoin that is considerably less disruptive to the status quo. If interested parties did not directly corrupt Bitcoin, they certainly benefit from its corruption. The same can be said for the rampant censorship online, the widespread information control, and the social media engineering that surrounds this topic. Even if the opposition did not cause it, they certainly benefit from it. If any cryptocurrency is going to compete against existing financial systems, we need to coordinate with each other. The more coordination that exists on the same project, the stronger it will become over time. If everybody builds on a separate network, none of those networks will succeed. This is why I am focusing primarily on Bitcoin Cash right now, because I know the underlying technology can scale, and it has already been battle tested in the real world. The vision for fast, cheap, reliable, inflation-proof digital cash is still alive, but it requires a network of people to bring it into existence. Software alone cannot improve the world. Humans are still required.